You think you're better than me? James Harris sneered as he ran his fingers along the razor's edge, a smirk playing at the corners of his lips. Sarah Blackwell stood motionless, the soft hum of the party echoing in the background. But in that moment, all the noise seemed to fade away. The opulent mansion, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, it all felt distant as she focused on the cold metal in James' hand. Sarah had been here before, laughed at, mocked, belittled, but today, something was different. She wasn't going to let it slide. James' eyes gleamed with malicious pleasure as he stepped closer, his grip tightening on the razor. He could feel the eyes of his parents and their friends on him, all watching as he prepared to humiliate the maid in front of everyone. "Let's see how confident you are now," he muttered under his breath, his gaze flickering to the door where Sarah had entered earlier. She had tried to stay invisible, to blend into the background, just as she always did. But James couldn't stand her quiet strength, her calm demeanor. He couldn't tolerate it when she didn't flinch. Sarah felt the sting of his words, but she stood still. The laughter of the guests filled the room, like an orchestra playing in the background, as James positioned himself behind her. With one swift movement, the razor glided through her hair, cutting it cleanly. The crowd gasped, but no one moved. It was like watching a cruel performance, one they were all too familiar with, yet no one ever dared to stop. But Sarah remained silent, holding her head high, even as her hair fell to the ground in uneven clumps. She didn't cry out. She didn't flinch. She didn't even look at him. She stood tall, her eyes fixed on the horizon, as if she could already see the future unfolding. The party continued around her, but she wasn't part of it anymore. She had stopped being a part of their world the moment she walked into that room. She had felt it before, the sting of judgment, the weight of their eyes. But today was different. This time, she was in control. James turned around, expecting to hear laughter, but it didn't come. The silence felt thick, as if the room itself was holding its breath. His parents exchanged uncomfortable glances. Sarah didn't speak, didn't even acknowledge them. She simply stood there, the weight of her silence more powerful than any words she could have said. "You can laugh all you want," Sarah thought, her voice a quiet whisper in her mind. "But you don't know who I am." James smirked, thinking the job was done. He couldn't wait to see the maid grovel, but Sarah remained poised, her eyes cold. The night carried on as expected, but Sarah was no longer just the maid. She was something more now, and by the time the sun rose the next day, everything would change. She would bring their empire to its knees, all because of a single, silent decision. A decision that would shock them all. And Sarah Blackwell would stand at the center of it, the woman they had underestimated, now poised to destroy everything they had built. The next morning, the sun rose with a quiet calm, but Sarah Blackwell was already awake, her mind racing. The sharp cut of the razor had stung, but it was nothing compared to the fire that now burned inside her. She had always been invisible to them, James, his parents, and the world they inhabited, but no longer. They had made a mistake, thinking she was just the maid, just a woman to be humiliated. They didn't know the truth about her. She had always been more than what they saw. As Sarah stood in front of the mirror, she ran her fingers through the short strands of her hair, the remnants of last night's humiliation. But it wasn't the hair that mattered. It was what she had been planning all along. She had overheard the conversations, the careless whispers, the deals being made in the corners of the Harris mansion. They had underestimated her, thinking she was just a quiet, obedient servant. But Sarah had been listening, observing, gathering the pieces. And now, the time had come to use them. By the time James Harris and his family woke up, they would already be too late. The empire they had built, their precious fortune, would begin to crumble. But it wouldn't be with a dramatic bang. No, it would be with the quiet, steady unraveling of every thread they had woven so carefully. Sarah was no longer just the maid. She was the one holding the scissors that would cut through the strings that tied their empire together. With a cool, calm focus, she stepped out of her small, humble apartment and into the streets of the city, her heart pounding with anticipation. She had spent years working in the shadows, waiting for the right moment. Now it had arrived. As Sarah walked through the bustling city streets, she passed by storefronts and crowds of people, but it all felt distant. Her focus was sharp, her mind clear. She wasn't thinking about the past, about the insults and the sneers. She was thinking about the future the future that she would create for herself. She didn't need their validation anymore. She didn't need to be anyone's servant. She would build something of her own, something that they would never see coming. As she approached the towering glass building that housed Harris Enterprises, she paused for a moment. The reflection of the skyline in the windows shimmered, but Sarah's eyes weren't focused on the buildings. They were focused on the door ahead of her, the door that led to the boardroom, the nerve center of their empire. She knew what she had to do. The security guards barely noticed her as she walked past, her calm demeanor making her blend seamlessly into the corporate world she had only ever observed from the outside. The elevator ride to the top floor was silent, but inside, her heart raced with the thrill of what was to come. She wasn't the maid anymore. She was someone they would have to reckon with. When the doors opened, she stepped into the grand lobby, her footsteps echoing in the marble halls. The familiar scent of polished wood and fresh flowers filled the air, but Sarah's focus was unwavering. She knew that the next few hours would change everything. The Harris family wouldn't know it yet, but their empire was already on the brink. Sarah had made sure of it. As she walked down the hallway toward the executive offices, she couldn't help but smile. They had underestimated her, and now it was her turn to show them just how wrong they were. Sarah stepped into the executive suite, the sleek glass doors sliding open effortlessly as she moved toward them. The polished floors reflected the soft light coming from the large windows that stretched across the walls, offering a breathtaking view of the city below. Everything about the space screamed wealth, power, and prestige, but Sarah felt none of it. She wasn't intimidated by the lavish surroundings or the idea of the powerful people who worked here. In fact, she felt a strange sense of calm, as though she belonged here more than she ever had in her life. She had spent years scrubbing floors, cleaning offices, listening to the deals and plans being made by men and women who thought they were untouchable. But now, the tables had turned. She was here for something much bigger than herself. Sarah walked past the reception desk, where the receptionist gave her a polite nod, but her eyes lingered, a hint of curiosity in her gaze. Sarah didn't flinch. She had practiced this moment for years, imagining it countless times, and now it was real. She was no longer the invisible woman in the back. She was here to be seen. At the end of the hallway, a massive door marked Harris Enterprises loomed ahead. It was the gateway to everything she had spent years planning to dismantle. As she approached, she could hear the voices of executives in the room, discussing their latest venture. Their laughter and confident chatter filled the air, but Sarah was focused only on the task at hand. She had no time for their arrogance. They thought they were invincible. They thought they were untouchable. But today, they would realize just how wrong they were. The security guard at the door didn't even glance up as she approached. Sarah, dressed in a professional black dress and simple shoes, had already passed the tests they set for everyone else. She was just another employee. The kind of employee who knew the value of discretion, who kept her mouth shut and did her job. But that was before. She was no longer that person. As she entered the boardroom, the voices fell silent. The executives turned to face her, their expressions shifting from indifference to confusion. They had no idea who she was, only that she was new, an unfamiliar face in their world. Sarah stood at the door. For a moment, allowing the silence to stretch, letting them wonder what she was there for. Finally, she broke the stillness, walking into the room with steady, measured steps. Her eyes flickered briefly over the long mahogany table, where the men and women of the Harris Empire sat, comfortable in their power. They were all dressed in expensive suits, each one wearing a look of superiority. They didn't see Sarah as a threat. But Sarah wasn't here for the usual small talk or to deliver a cup of coffee. She was here to do what they never saw coming. She walked to the head of the table, where the CEO of the company sat, a man whose face was all too familiar to her. He was the one who had laughed at her, who had looked down on her. He was the one who had thought he could crush her without a second thought. But now, it was his empire that was crumbling. "Mr. Harris," Sarah said, her voice calm but firm. "I think it's time we had a conversation about your company's future." The room fell silent again. The CEO looked at her with a mix of confusion and disdain, as if he couldn't quite place her. But Sarah wasn't going to give him the luxury of time. She had prepared for this moment, and she wasn't about to let it slip away. "You've been making some very risky decisions lately," Sarah continued, her gaze unwavering. And I think it's time someone pointed out just how dangerous those choices really are. The executives exchanged glances, some of them shifting in their seats. They didn't know what to expect, but they could sense the tension building in the room. Sarah could feel the weight of their eyes on her, but she didn't back down. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to stop now. The man at the head of the table finally spoke, his voice tight with annoyance. "Who do you think you are, barging in here and telling us how to run our business?" His tone was mocking, but Sarah didn't flinch. "I think I'm the person who just saved your company from going under," she replied evenly. And with that, she slid the carefully prepared file across the table, watching as the CEO's eyes widened in shock. They had no idea what was coming. They had no idea that Sarah Blackwell was the one who would bring their empire to its knees. Sarah stood there, watching the CEO's face transform from disbelief to anger as he glanced down at the file she had placed in front of him. The other executives in the room remained silent, their eyes flickering between Sarah and the document, unsure of what to make of this unexpected turn of events. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of Sarah's steady breathing. She had anticipated this reaction. After all, they had no idea who she truly was or what she was capable of. "You think you can come in here and make demands?" The CEO's voice was tight with frustration, but there was an edge of uncertainty beneath the anger. Sarah didn't flinch. She knew the power of silence, the strength in remaining calm while the other person lost control. "I'm not making demands," she replied, her voice steady and firm. "I'm showing you the truth, something your team overlooked." The CEO's eyes narrowed as he looked at the file again, scanning the contents. The room was thick with tension as he read through the documents Sarah had carefully compiled. These weren't just numbers. They were the cracks in the foundation of Harris Enterprises, errors, missed opportunities, and risky investments that had the potential to bring the entire empire down. His fingers trembled slightly as he turned the pages, the reality of the situation beginning to sink in. "This is impossible," he muttered under his breath, but Sarah could hear the doubt in his voice. She had prepared for this moment, using her knowledge of their operations and her understanding of their weaknesses. She had spent months gathering information, quietly observing and learning from the shadows. And now, she was finally ready to make them face the consequences of their greed and carelessness. As the CEO continued to read, Sarah remained still, her gaze unwavering. She could feel the weight of the moment, the power that was shifting. She wasn't just the maid anymore. She wasn't the invisible woman they had dismissed. She was the one in control now. The silence in the room stretched on, punctuated only by the sound of paper being flipped. Sarah could sense the growing unease among the executives. Some of them exchanged glances, their expressions betraying the uncertainty that had begun to creep in. The CEO finally looked up, his face pale. "You can't expect us to believe this," he said, his voice shaky. "These numbers are fabricated. You don't know what you're talking about." Sarah met his gaze, her expression calm but resolute. "You can keep denying it, but the truth is in front of you. The decisions you've made will cost you everything." The room seemed to hold its breath. The weight of Sarah's words hung in the air, and for the first time, the executives began to realize that they were no longer in control. They had underestimated her, just as they had underestimated the power of the truth. The CEO stood up abruptly, pacing back and forth. His mind raced, trying to figure out how to recover from this blow, but deep down, he knew it was already too late. The empire he had built was starting to crack, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Sarah didn't need to say anything more. She had done what she came here to do. She had exposed their lies, their mistakes, and now, the consequences would follow. As she turned to leave the room, her mind already focused on the next steps of her plan, she knew that this was just the beginning. The Harris Empire would crumble, piece by piece, and she would be there to watch it fall. The following days passed in a blur of quiet tension as the executives at Harris Enterprises scrambled to deal with the revelations Sarah had brought to light. The once secure empire was now a house of cards, teetering on the brink of collapse. Sarah kept her distance, watching from the sidelines as the chaos unfolded. She had given them the information, exposed their weaknesses, and now, she was ready to watch them unravel. The media caught wind of the scandal almost immediately, and soon, the boardroom was flooded with calls from investors, lawyers, and reporters demanding answers. The very foundation of Harris Enterprises, once thought impenetrable, was now under siege. The CEO, once a figure of authority and control, had become a mere shadow of himself. His usual arrogance was replaced by a palpable fear, and his decisions, once confident and precise, were now hesitant and uncertain. In the midst of it all, Sarah remained calm. She had anticipated their reaction, knew exactly how they would respond. The arrogance, the denial, it was all part of the plan. She had already set her sights on the next phase of her mission, complete dismantling. Sarah knew the power of patience. She had spent years biding her time, learning their secrets, understanding their weaknesses. Now that she had the upper hand, she was playing her cards carefully, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. The first signs of trouble came when the company's stock prices began to fall. Slowly at first, then with increasing speed. As rumors swirled and panic spread among the investors, the once coveted shares became a liability. The board of directors convened urgently, trying to save face, trying to salvage whatever they could. But Sarah knew better. There was no saving them now. The damage was done. The truth had been exposed, and nothing could undo the consequences. As the days went by, more and more executives began to distance themselves from the company, their departure only further signaling the inevitable downfall. Sarah kept her composure, watching it all unfold from afar. It was almost too easy. They had been so sure of their invincibility, so confident that nothing could touch them. But now, they were crumbling, just as she had planned. The final blow came when the CEO, desperate to save what was left of his empire, tried to make a deal with Sarah. He called her into his office, his face strained with a mixture of frustration and fear. "You don't have to do this," he pleaded, his voice faltering. "You have the power to stop this. We can make a deal. We can fix this. I can offer you whatever you want." Sarah stared at him, her eyes cold and unwavering. She had no interest in his offers, no desire for their wealth or power. What she wanted was something far more satisfying: justice. "There's nothing to fix," she said calmly. "The truth is already out. It's too late." The CEO slumped in his chair, the weight of his failure finally sinking in. Sarah turned and walked out of his office, her mission complete. She had brought them down, not with force or violence, but with the quiet power of truth. And as she walked away, she knew that this was just the beginning. Harris Enterprises would never recover from this. Sarah had exposed them for who they really were, and their empire would fall piece by piece. She had taken control of her own destiny, and in doing so, she had shown them all the cost of underestimating her. Days turned into weeks, and the fallout from the scandal that Sarah had triggered continued to ripple through the corporate world. Harris Enterprises, once a powerhouse in the business world, was now a shadow of its former self. The company's stock had plummeted, and with each passing day, more high-profile clients and partners distanced themselves from the sinking ship. The media coverage was relentless. Headlines screamed about the downfall of the Harris dynasty, about how a seemingly invisible woman had taken down a multi-billion-dollar empire. Sarah had become a symbol, a living proof that no one, no matter how powerful, was untouchable. She remained silent, letting the storm brew around her while she focused on her next move. She didn't need the fame or the media attention. What mattered to her was the deeper change she had set into motion. The executives, the board members, the investors, they were all scrambling, trying to salvage whatever remained of the company. But the damage was irreversible. The corruption, the negligence, the years of manipulation had been exposed for all to see. And Sarah knew it was only a matter of time before the whole empire crumbled. In the midst of the chaos, the CEO, who had once looked down on Sarah, was now facing legal battles, financial ruin, and the collapse of everything he had worked for. He was no longer the man in control. He was just another player in a game he had no chance of winning. Sarah knew the tides were turning, but she didn't take any joy in the downfall. It wasn't about revenge. It was about justice, about exposing the truth that had been buried for so long. As the company's assets were liquidated and the executives fled to save themselves, Sarah saw something else happening. A new opportunity was emerging. People were starting to look at her differently, not just as the maid who had brought down a corporation, but as someone who had the power to create something better. The truth had been her weapon, but now, it was time for her to build her own empire, one based on fairness and integrity. Sarah didn't need Harris Enterprises to do that. She had already proven that she could take down the giants, and now it was time for her to rise. With the weight of the past behind her, she began to take the first steps toward her future. She met with potential investors, leaders who were tired of the corruption that had tainted the business world for so long. They were ready for something different, something that wasn't built on lies and exploitation. Sarah knew it wouldn't be easy. She knew there would be obstacles along the way, people who would try to bring her down, just as they had done before. But she was ready. She had been tested, and now, she was stronger than ever. She wasn't just a product of her circumstances anymore. She was a force of her own making, and no one could stop her. As Sarah walked into her new office, a small but powerful space that would soon become the headquarters of her new venture, she felt a sense of pride. She had done it. She had taken down an empire, but more importantly, she had built a foundation for something better. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a creator, and this was only the beginning. Months passed since Sarah had begun her new venture, and with every passing day, her empire grew stronger. The world had taken notice of her, and now she was building something that was entirely her own, something rooted in integrity and transparency. Investors who had once been loyal to the Harris family were now seeking her out, eager to join her in creating a business model that focused on fairness and responsibility. But even as her business expanded, Sarah remained focused. She never forgot the lessons of the past, the way she had been underestimated, the way the world had looked down on her. She had used those experiences as fuel, and now they were the foundation of everything she was building. The walls of her new office were lined with windows that offered a panoramic view of the city below. The skyline seemed to stretch endlessly, a reminder of how far she had come. Every day, she walked into that office with a sense of purpose, knowing that she was not just changing her own life, but the lives of everyone around her. She had become a symbol of resilience, a beacon for those who had been overlooked and dismissed. Sarah's team, once small but growing rapidly, was made up of people who shared her vision. They weren't just employees, they were partners, collaborators in something bigger than themselves. And together, they were creating something that would last. As Sarah sat at the head of the conference table, she couldn't help but smile. The room was filled with eager faces, people who were excited about the future, about the possibilities that lay ahead. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about making a real difference. And Sarah knew that they were on the verge of something extraordinary. One afternoon, as Sarah was reviewing a new partnership proposal, her phone buzzed with an incoming call. She glanced at the screen and saw the name of her old colleague from the Harris Company. It had been months since she had spoken to anyone from that world, but something about the call intrigued her. She picked up the phone. "Sarah, it's Jonathan," the voice on the other end said, a mix of urgency and uncertainty in his tone. "I know you've moved on, but we need your help. Things have gone terribly wrong. Harris Enterprises is done, but there's something bigger going on behind the scenes. We don't know who else to turn to." Jonathan's words were heavy with the weight of desperation, and for a moment, Sarah hesitated. She had already moved on, already left that world behind. But there was something about his voice, something that made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, the time had come for her to return, not as a maid, not as a servant, but as the force of change she had become. After a long pause, Sarah spoke. "Tell me everything." What Jonathan revealed was even darker than she could have imagined. There were people, powerful people, who had never intended for Harris Enterprises to fall. They had orchestrated the whole thing, using Sarah's rise to power as a distraction, a smokescreen for a larger scheme that threatened the very foundation of the business world. Sarah listened carefully, piecing together the information. She knew that this was not just about revenge or redemption anymore. This was about something much bigger, something that could reshape the world of business as they knew it. And for the first time in months, Sarah felt a spark of excitement. She wasn't done yet. There was still work to do, and this new challenge would require everything she had learned. But Sarah was ready. She had faced the impossible before and had come out on top. Now, she was prepared to take on the forces that had been pulling the strings behind the scenes, to expose the truth once and for all. As the meeting ended, Sarah stood up from her desk, her heart racing with determination. She knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but she also knew that this was her moment. She had come too far to turn back now. The future was hers to shape, and this time, no one would stop her. Sarah hung up the phone and sat back in her chair, her mind racing with the new information she had just received. Jonathan's words echoed in her head, and she knew, without a doubt, that this was no ordinary challenge. It was bigger than she had ever anticipated. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the image they created was one that she could never have imagined. She had thought that taking down Harris Enterprises was the hardest part. Now, she realized it was just the beginning. The people behind the scenes, the ones who had been pulling the strings all along, were far more dangerous than anyone she had encountered before. But that didn't matter. Sarah had never been one to back down from a fight. In fact, this was exactly what she had been waiting for. The opportunity to expose the true corruption that had plagued the business world for so long. She stood up from her desk and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. It was still early in the morning, and the streets were bustling with life. But Sarah knew that things were about to change. She could feel it in the air. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had been oppressed, overlooked, and silenced by the powerful few who thought they could control everything. The next day, Sarah met with a trusted ally, someone she had worked with in the past but hadn't seen in months. His name was James, and he had been a key player in bringing down the Harris Empire. He had helped her gather information, provided insight into the inner workings of the business world, and together, they had taken down one of the most powerful corporations in the country. But now, they needed each other more than ever. As Sarah walked into the small cafe where they had arranged to meet, she saw James sitting at a corner table, his face tense with worry. He looked up as she approached and gestured for her to sit. "We have a problem," he said before she could even take a seat. "It's worse than we thought." Sarah raised an eyebrow, already sensing the gravity of the situation. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice steady. "I've been digging into the people behind Harris," James continued, leaning in slightly, lowering his voice. "They're not just businessmen. They're connected to some of the most powerful people in the world, politicians, foreign investors, people with ties to organized crime." Sarah listened intently, her mind processing the information. This was no longer just about business or money. It was about something much more dangerous. These people had connections that spanned continents, and they would stop at nothing to protect their power. But Sarah was not afraid. She had faced powerful enemies before, and she had always come out on top. "So what do we do?" she asked, her voice resolute. James looked at her, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. "We need to expose them, all of them. But it's not going to be easy. These people won't go down without a fight." Sarah nodded. "Then we fight. We expose them all, and we take them down." Over the next few weeks, Sarah and James worked tirelessly, gathering more information, making connections, and plotting their next move. The deeper they dug, the more they uncovered hidden accounts, illegal dealings, and a network of corruption that reached far beyond Harris Enterprises. They were getting closer to the truth, but they knew it wouldn't be long before the people they were after would come after them. Sarah had no intention of letting them win, though. She was determined to bring them down, no matter the cost. As the pieces of the puzzle began to come together, Sarah realized that this was the ultimate test. She had already taken down one empire, but now she was facing something much bigger, and she was ready. Ready to expose the darkness, ready to fight, and ready to win. The days that followed were a blur of strategy and anticipation. Sarah and James had gathered everything they needed, but they knew the final step would be the hardest. They were now targeting the heart of the network, the very individuals who had been behind the corruption, the ones who thought they were untouchable. They knew these people were powerful, too powerful for anyone to take down easily. But Sarah was ready. The more she learned, the more she understood how deep the rot went, how intertwined these individuals were with the world's elites. They weren't just criminals or corrupt businessmen. They were the puppet masters pulling the strings of the global economy, and Sarah was prepared to expose every single one of them. The plan was simple, but the stakes were higher than anything Sarah had ever faced before. She wasn't just taking down a corporation now. She was shaking the foundations of a system that had been built on deceit and manipulation for decades. There would be no turning back once they launched their final attack. As the day of their big move approached, Sarah could feel the weight of what they were about to do. It wasn't just about revenge or exposing the truth anymore. It was about bringing about real change. They were about to challenge the very system that had kept the powerful at the top for so long. But Sarah didn't hesitate. She had already proven that she could dismantle an empire, and now she was ready to take down the network that had sustained it. The night before they were set to go public, Sarah stood in her office, looking out over the city. The skyline glittered with lights, but she saw past the glittering facade. She saw the corruption, the lies, and the power that had kept people like her in the shadows for so long. But not anymore. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, she would expose the truth. The next morning, Sarah and James were in the office early, ready to begin. They had everything in place: files, evidence, connections. They were going to drop it all at once, sending shockwaves through the media and the global business world. Sarah wasn't nervous. She was calm, focused, and determined. They began with a press conference, a carefully orchestrated event that would launch the final phase of their plan. As the cameras flashed and the reporters gathered, Sarah took the stage. She was no longer the maid, no longer the invisible woman in the background. She was the one in control. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah began, her voice steady and clear, "I'm here today to expose the truth about a network of corruption that has been hiding in plain sight for far too long." The room fell silent as the reporters hung on her every word. She continued, laying out the evidence, naming the powerful figures involved, and revealing the truth behind Harris Enterprises' downfall. The media reacted instantly. Headlines spread like wildfire, and soon, the entire world was watching. The people who had once thought they were untouchable were now scrambling to cover their tracks, to deny everything Sarah had just revealed. But it was too late. The floodgates had opened. The truth was out, and there was no going back. Sarah watched as the media frenzy took hold, but she wasn't done yet. This was just the beginning. Over the next few days, more and more revelations came to light, and the system that had protected the corrupt elite began to crumble. Executives were arrested, connections were severed, and the network that had kept the powerful at the top was now in full retreat. Sarah had done it. She had taken down not just one empire, but the very system that had allowed it to thrive. As the dust settled, Sarah stood in the middle of it, all feeling the weight of what she had accomplished. It wasn't about the recognition, the fame, or the power. It was about the change she had brought. She had torn down the walls that had kept her and so many others oppressed. And now, she was free. Sarah knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would always be those who would try to bring her down. But she was ready for whatever came next. She had faced the impossible, and she had won. The world had changed, and Sarah had been the one to make it happen.